Rain poured over the wide, empty ranch, turning the dry earth into dark, muddy patches. The sky hung low and heavy, the kind of gray that makes the whole world feel quiet. Inside the ranch house, the owner stood by his window, watching the storm roll across his land. He was used to silence. He was used to standing alone, but something outside broke the familiar stillness. There, near the far fence line, a small figure moved through the rain. At first, he thought it might be an animal, maybe a stray calf or a deer passing by. But then he saw the shape more clearly. It was a woman. She was bent slightly forward, pushing against the wind, reaching for the broken wooden rails of his fence. He narrowed his eyes, trying to understand what he was seeing. The storm was strong. The rain slapped against her back, soaking her clothes until they clung to her skin. Yet she didn't slow down. She lifted a loose board, pressed it into place, and tied it with a piece of wire she pulled from her pocket. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicking. She worked as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. He felt an unexpected pull of curiosity. No one visited his ranch. No one crossed this far out unless they had a reason. But this woman didn't look like she was trespassing. She didn't look like she wanted trouble. She looked like someone simply trying to fix something that wasn't hers. Lightning flashed across the sky for a moment, lighting up the field, and he saw her face more clearly, focused, tired, and calm. She pushed wet hair from her eyes and kept going. Every movement looked thoughtful and careful, almost gentle, even as the wind tried to push her off balance. He took a slow breath. Why would anyone fix a stranger's fence, especially in weather like this? It didn't make sense. Most people he knew wouldn't do such a thing even on a sunny day. And yet here she was, working alone, fighting the storm as if she owed the land something. Another gust of wind hit, and for a second she paused, steadying herself with one hand on the fence. He felt something inside him tighten, concern, maybe, or something harder to name. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she was there. But something told him this wasn't just a random moment in the rain, and he couldn't look away. The rancher had lived on this land for most of his life, and over the years it had grown as large and quiet as he had. Thousands of acres stretched in every direction, broken only by fences, winding dirt roads, and the slow movements of grazing cattle. Most people would think owning this much land meant a life full of activity, maybe even excitement. But for him, it was mostly long days spent in silence, where the loudest sound was often the crunch of gravel under his boots or the low call of a cow somewhere in the distance. He wasn't old, not really. Just worn in the same way the ranch was, weathered by time and responsibility. His father had left him the property, and when he passed, the rancher took over without question. It was what he knew. It was what he was expected to do. But he never imagined that running a ranch, even with workers coming and going during the busy months, would feel so isolating. At first, the quiet had been comforting, a kind of peace he thought he wanted. But as the years went by, the silence started to sound different. Less like peace, more like something missing. He lived alone in the big ranch house, a place built with enough rooms for a family he never had. The halls stayed empty. The kitchen table stayed set for one. The walls held old photos, his parents, a few distant relatives, some ranch hands from years gone by, but nothing recent. He didn't take new pictures anymore. There wasn't much to take them of. Most mornings were the same. He woke before sunrise, made coffee that he drank while staring out the window, then rode out to check the land. Fixing fences, checking water troughs, moving cattle from one field to another. These things kept him busy, but they didn't fill the emptiness. And ranch life, as big as it looked from the outside, often shrank down to the same routine repeated again and again. People in town knew he had money. The ranch was profitable, the cattle business strong, and his family had been respected for generations. But money didn't bring anyone close. If anything, it built more space between him and others. Folks treated him politely, sometimes too politely. They showed respect but not warmth. He couldn't remember the last time someone visited the ranch just to talk or sit on the porch with him for a while. Friendship wasn't something he found easily, and he told himself he didn't need it. But lately, he caught himself noticing the quiet more. The long evenings where the house felt bigger than it should. The sound of his own footsteps echoing back at him. The way the sun set behind the hills, leaving him alone with nothing but the ticking of the old clock in the living room. Some nights he stayed up late, sitting in his chair, staring at the empty space across from him. The room felt different then, like the shadows carried all the conversations he never had. He didn't talk about loneliness. He didn't admit it, even to himself. He just let it settle around him like an old coat he had forgotten how to take off. That's why seeing someone outside, someone working on his fence in the storm, hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just the surprise of it. It was the reminder that other people existed out there, doing things, living lives, moving through the world in ways he no longer felt connected to. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one ever was. The ranch didn't get visitors who came on foot, much less women with nothing but a backpack and a determination stronger than the rain. He stayed by the window longer than he meant to, studying her through the sheets of water. He watched the way she moved, steady and purposeful. She didn't look like someone lost or confused. She didn't look like someone who needed help. She looked like someone who had a reason to be there, even if he couldn't figure out what that reason was. He thought about all the times he had fixed that fence himself. Sometimes it broke during storms, sometimes from cattle pushing through. He had mended those boards so many times he knew every nail and knot in the wood. Yet now a stranger was out there doing what he usually did, and she was doing it with a kind of patience that made him feel something. Something strange. Something like he wasn't as alone as he had been yesterday. The more he watched, the more uneasy he became, not because she seemed dangerous but because he couldn't explain why she was there. People didn't wander onto private ranch land. They didn't fix fences that didn't belong to them. And they definitely didn't do it while standing in the middle of a storm like this one. Lightning cracked again, lighting up the sky and the field. For a split second he saw her clearly, the rain pouring off her face, her hands gripping the wood, her expression tight with effort. She didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. Something about that determination made him feel a weight in his chest. A recognition, maybe. A memory of working through storms when he was younger, when his father told him a broken fence never waited for clear skies. But she wasn't him. She had no reason to push herself like this. No reason he could think of. He stepped back from the window, rubbing a hand over his beard. He felt restless in a way he hadn't felt in years. The storm outside seemed to stir something inside him too, something he had pushed down for a long time. He tried to go back to his chair, but he couldn't sit. He paced instead, glancing outside every few seconds, pulled by an urge he didn't quite understand. Who was she? Why was she helping him? And why did he care so suddenly, so sharply, after so many years of not caring about anyone at all? The rain kept falling, and she kept working. And for the first time in a long time, the ranch didn't feel entirely empty. He grabbed his coat from the hook, slipping it on without thinking. The house felt too small now, too quiet, and the storm outside suddenly seemed easier to face than the questions swirling in his mind. When he stepped out onto the porch, the rain hit him hard, cold and sharp, but he barely noticed. His focus stayed on the figure by the fence. As he walked closer, his boots sinking into the wet ground, she didn't hear him at first. The wind was loud, pushing the rain sideways, rattling the loosened pieces of wire she was trying to secure. She was focused, completely absorbed in the task. Her hands trembled slightly from the cold, but her movements never stopped. There was something about the way she worked, steady, almost stubborn, that made him slow down instead of calling out to her right away. When he finally got close enough, he cleared his throat, trying not to startle her. She jumped anyway. Her head snapped up, and for the first time he saw her face clearly, young, but tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep. Her eyes were sharp, alert, as though she was used to watching her surroundings with caution. She wiped rain from her forehead quickly, almost nervously. "Sorry," she said first, not even giving him a chance to speak. "I didn't mean to trespass." Her voice was soft, yet carried a kind of practiced politeness. It wasn't the tone of someone who expected kindness in return. It was the tone of someone who learned to apologize before anything else. "This is my fence," he said, raising his voice a little to be heard over the wind. "I noticed you working on it." She nodded once, her eyes dropping to the muddy ground as if embarrassed. "It was broken. I figured your cattle could get through. I thought I should fix it before anything got out." He stared at her for a moment, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. Most people would have walked past a broken fence without a second thought. She looked like she didn't even know him, yet she'd been standing here for who knows how long, doing work that wasn't hers. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know." She lifted the wire again, twisting it into place with a firmness that surprised him. "But it needed doing." The simple answer caught him off guard. No excuses, no long explanation. Just a plain truth spoken with a kind of honesty he wasn't used to hearing. He noticed more details now. The way her jacket sagged from being soaked through, the frayed ends of her sleeves, the old backpack leaning against the fence post a few feet away. It was small, far too small for someone traveling anywhere far, not much bigger than the kind kids carried to school. "You're out here alone?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She paused for barely a second before nodding. "Yeah." Her answer was quick, too quick, like someone who didn't want to invite more questions. She returned to the fence as if hoping he would just walk away and let her finish. But he didn't. He stayed exactly where he was, watching her, trying to understand the odd mix of strength and fragility in the way she held herself. He stepped closer, offering his hand. "Let me help. The rain's making this harder than it needs to be." Her eyes flicked to his hand, then to his face, measuring something silently. Trust wasn't something she gave easily, that much was obvious. After a moment, she handed him the wire. Their fingers brushed for just a second, and he felt how cold her skin was. Much colder than it should have been for someone working so hard. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. She shrugged one shoulder. "A little while." A little while could mean anything. An hour, all day. He glanced at the backpack again. It sat on the ground like an afterthought, the straps muddy, the fabric worn thin. If everything she owned was in there, she didn't want him to know. The wind blew harder and she shivered. He saw it this time. The tight grip she used to steady herself, the small tremble that ran through her body. But she tried to hide it, pretending to focus on the fence. "You should get out of the rain," he said softly. "I'm almost done," she replied quickly. "It's okay." That wasn't the answer he asked for, and she knew it, but she wasn't ready to explain anything deeper. Her body language said as much. Her shoulders pulled inward, defensive. Her eyes stayed on her work rather than on him. She acted like someone expecting judgment or rejection, someone who didn't want to give him the chance to offer either. He crouched beside her, helping hold the board steady. "You fix fences for a living," he tried, attempting a lighter tone. She let out a breath that might have been a quiet laugh. "No, I just do what I can. Out in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes." Her answer was soft but firm. She didn't elaborate. Her hair clung to her face, wet and tangled. Mud streaked her boots and the bottoms of her jeans. She looked like she had been walking a long time, far longer than she was willing to admit. And still, she worked with a kind of care that people rarely gave to things they didn't own. The rancher felt something pressing at him again, a sense of protectiveness he hadn't expected. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew hardship when he saw it. And standing this close, watching her fight the cold, fight the rain, fight whatever life had thrown at her before this moment, he could tell she had been fighting alone for a very long time. The last piece of wire tightened under her fingers, and she released a small breath, as if relieved she had finished. But the relief didn't reach her eyes. They held something else, something tired, something that made him feel an ache he didn't understand. She stepped back from the fence, wiping water from her face with the back of her hand. The wind pushed against her again, and she steadied herself. He wanted to ask her more. He wanted to know who she was, where she had come from, and why she had chosen his fence, of all places, to repair in the pouring rain. But the words didn't come yet. He just stood there, staring at her, unable to shake the feeling that nothing about this moment was simple, and nothing about her was ordinary. The rain eased for a moment, softening into a light drizzle, and in that small break of calm he noticed something he hadn't seen before. When she bent down to pick up her backpack, the zipper wouldn't close all the way. A corner of a blanket poked out, worn thin at the edges. Beneath it, he saw the handle of a metal water bottle dented on one side, a faded notebook, and a bundle of clothes rolled tight. It wasn't much. In fact, it was everything someone could carry who didn't have anywhere else to put their things. She tugged the zipper, trying to force it shut, but it kept getting stuck. Her fingers shook from the cold. He could see the struggle even from a few steps away. She noticed him watching and quickly turned the bag, hiding the open part from view, pretending it was fine. But the image was already locked in his mind. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You all right?" She nodded too fast. "Yeah, I'm fine, just need to get going." "Going where?" he asked. Her eyes flicked sideways, then down. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted the backpack onto her shoulder with effort. It was heavier than it looked. The weight made her lean slightly to one side as she adjusted the strap. He felt the shift in the air, something unspoken hanging between them. She seemed ready to leave, ready to disappear back into the rain like someone who knew how to vanish before trouble found her. But he couldn't let her go just yet. Something in him resisted the idea, something deeper than curiosity. "You walked here," he said, more as a statement than a question. She didn't deny it. She just gave a small shrug, the kind that avoided committing to any truth. "This land goes on for miles," he continued. "No houses, no stores. Nothing around. You must have come a long way." Another shrug. The rain picked up again, tapping against her jacket like tiny drums. She wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but more like a shield. A way to make herself smaller, harder to read, harder to reach. He tried a different approach. "You fix fences often," her mouth lifted in a weak smile. "Only when they're broken." Her answer should have been funny, but it wasn't. Not really. It felt like a shield too, something she said to keep him from looking deeper. He realized she had a habit of speaking in short, simple sentences, answers that revealed just enough to keep someone from pressing further. He watched her shoulders rise and fall in a slow breath. She was trying to steady herself, not from fear, but from the tension of being questioned. She seemed like someone used to explaining her presence to strangers, used to proving she wasn't a threat, used to being pushed away. He recognized the instinct to hide. He had seen it before in strays that wandered near his property. Quiet creatures who wanted safety but didn't trust they'd find it. The wind blew again, lifting the corner of her jacket. He saw the thin shirt underneath, not nearly warm enough for this weather. She caught the jacket quickly and held it closed, glancing at him as if checking whether he noticed. He did, but he didn't say anything yet. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I should keep moving," she said, barely meeting his eyes. "Didn't mean to bother you." "You didn't," he replied instantly. His tone was steadier than he expected. Clearly, something in him tightened at the thought of her leaving. He couldn't explain it, but he didn't want her to vanish. Not like this. Not soaked, not shivering, not pretending she had somewhere better to go. He spoke gently. "You don't have to rush off." "I'm used to it," she murmured. That sentence hit him harder than anything else she'd said so far. Used to it. Used to moving. Used to leaving. Used to not belonging anywhere long enough to stay. She took one step backward and he reacted without thinking, taking a step forward. Not to block her, but to bridge the space that suddenly felt too wide. "I've got warm coffee inside," he said. "And towels. You must be frozen." "I'm okay," she insisted. But her voice wavered, just slightly, just enough. He followed her gaze as it drifted toward the open fields. There was nothing out there for miles, just wet grass, muddy tracks, and the kind of empty horizon that offered no shelter. No buildings, no cars, no path that promised safety or warmth. She wasn't heading anywhere. She was just heading away. and he realized the truth in an instant as clearly as if she had spoken it out loud. She had no destination, no home waiting, no reason to believe she'd be welcomed anywhere she stopped. The cold breeze swept across her face, making her flinch. She pulled her backpack strap tighter, holding onto it like it was the only stable thing in her world. He couldn't let her walk off alone. Not in this weather. Not when the signs were all there. The thin layers, the too small bag, the weary look of someone who hadn't rested in days. But he didn't want to scare her by being too pushy. He needed her to trust him, even just a little. "You fixed my fence," he said softly. "Least I can do is offer you a warm place to dry off. No strings attached." She hesitated. For the first time she really looked at him, eyes searching, studying his expression as if trying to see whether he meant it, whether this was kindness or danger, whether she could risk taking even a small step toward safety. Her voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. "People don't offer things like that, not for no reason." "They do," he said, "when they mean it." Silence settled between them. The kind that felt fragile. The kind that comes right before someone chooses to trust or chooses to run. A moment later, her fingers loosened their tight grip on the backpack strap. Not much, but enough to show she was thinking. Enough to reveal the truth she hadn't said yet. She didn't want to keep walking into the storm. And for the first time, he understood, deeply, that this strange, quiet woman fixing his fence wasn't just passing through. She had nowhere else to go. He watched her stand there in the rain, her fingers still resting on the strap of her backpack as if she couldn't decide whether to hold on tighter or let go. She wasn't running, but she wasn't stepping closer either. She was caught somewhere in between, hovering in that fragile space where trust tries to grow but fear still has the stronger grip. He lowered his voice, making it warm, steady, human. "You must be tired." She blinked, as though the simple sentence had reached a place she'd been guarding too closely. Tired didn't just mean physically worn out. It meant weary in a way sleep alone couldn't fix. And something in her eyes told him she understood that he understood. The rain softened to a slow drizzle again, tapping softly against the fence she'd just repaired. She turned slightly, glancing back at her work with a quiet sense of duty. It was solid, secure, better than he would have expected from someone repairing a stranger's fence for no reason at all. She wasn't careless. She wasn't reckless. She cared, even about something that didn't belong to her. He tried again, taking a careful step forward. "It's warm inside, really warm, and I've got a fire going." She swallowed hard. It was small, but he saw it. Her body reacted to the idea of warmth even if her mind refused to commit to it yet. "You don't have to stay long," he added gently. "Just long enough to dry off and warm up. That's all." Her hands slowly slid into her jacket pockets, hiding the trembling he already noticed. She took a breath and stared at the muddy ground, as if trying to weigh all the dangers, all the possibilities. She finally whispered, "People don't usually invite strangers into their homes." "People don't usually fix fences that aren't theirs," he replied. The smallest hint of a smile tugged at her mouth, the first real softness he'd seen from her. It didn't stay long, but it appeared, a sign of someone who wasn't closed off, just cautious. She lifted her head again. Her hair clung to her cheeks, water dripping from the ends. Her eyes searched his face with a kind of quiet desperation, like she wanted to believe him but wasn't sure she deserved whatever kindness he was offering. He didn't look away. He let her see the sincerity in his expression, the concern he hadn't felt for anyone in years. The ranch had given him everything except human connection. And now, faced with a stranger who carried her entire life in a backpack, he felt something shift inside him, an instinct to shelter, to protect. She took a slow, tentative breath. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not," he said firmly. "If anything, you've saved me trouble. That fence needed fixing." Her eyes softened again, almost melting at the edges. "I just help where I can." He nodded. "Let me help now." Lightning flickered faintly in the distance, far enough away to feel less threatening but close enough to remind him that she shouldn't be walking miles through open country in weather like this. The sky carried the promise of another storm building behind the first, and she didn't seem like someone who had anywhere to go when the next wave hit. He extended his hand, not to shake hers, not to pull her, but simply to offer a small bridge. She stared at it for a long moment. The rain clung to his sleeve, dripping off the edge of his coat. Her breath hitched, barely noticeable unless someone was watching closely. "I'm not used to accepting help," she murmured. "I'm not used to offering it," he admitted. It was the truth, unexpected, simple, honest. She looked at him then, really looked, beyond the hat and the coat and the mud splattered on his boots. She saw the loneliness in him, the kind that mirrors itself in others without either person meaning for it to happen. Something softened deep inside her, and her shoulders lowered a fraction, her body finally surrendering a bit of the tension it held onto for too long. Then, quietly, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were ice cold. He felt it instantly. A protective instinct kicked in so strongly it startled him, like a spark lighting inside his chest. "Come on," he said gently. He didn't pull her. He just walked, still holding her hand lightly, giving her the chance to follow at her own pace. And she did. Not quickly, not eagerly, but willingly. Each step looked like a careful choice, a cautious acceptance of something she hadn't felt safe accepting for a long time. As they reached the porch, she hesitated again, glancing back at the open fields behind her. The horizon stretched endlessly, gray and empty, as if reminding her of all the nights she had spent wandering places like this with no shelter waiting for her. "Inside?" he asked softly. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay." He opened the door and warm air spilled out, carrying the scent of coffee and the glowing orange flicker of the fireplace inside. She stepped in slowly, like someone entering another world, one she wasn't sure she belonged in. Her soaked shoes left small puddles on the wooden floor, but he didn't tell her to take them off. He didn't correct her or guide her or judge her. He just watched her take it all in, the warmth, the light, the simple safety of being indoors. She shifted awkwardly, looking unsure of where to stand. Her backpack sagged on her shoulder, heavy with the weight of a life lived outdoors. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the rain. For the first time, she wasn't alone in the storm. And for the first time in a long while, neither was he. The warmth inside the ranch house wrapped around her like something unfamiliar but deeply missed. She stood just past the doorway, dripping water onto the floor, clutching her backpack like it was the only solid thing in her life. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, the glowing fireplace, the wooden beams overhead, the worn furniture that looked lived in but cared for. Everything about the space felt steady, rooted. The opposite of her world, which seemed to shift beneath her feet every day. He took off his coat, hanging it on a hook near the door before turning back to her. She stood completely still, like she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to move or breathe too loudly. He didn't rush her. He didn't tell her what to do. He just walked to the fireplace and added another log, giving her the time she needed. The flames crackled, throwing warm light across the room. She watched them with an expression he couldn't quite read, part wonder, part fear, part something deeper. Maybe she was remembering the last time she had been near a fire. Or maybe she was trying to understand why kindness felt harder to accept than the cold rain outside. "You can come closer," he said gently. "The fire helps." She hesitated, then took a small step forward, then another. Her wet clothes made soft, dripping sounds on the floor as she moved. When she reached the edge of the rug, she stopped again, as if afraid of crossing some invisible line of comfort she didn't feel entitled to. He grabbed a clean towel from a nearby cabinet and held it out to her. "Here." She reached for it slowly. When her fingers touched the fabric, her breath shook just a little. Not because she was cold now, but because something inside her was thawing too quickly, too unexpectedly. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and stepped back to give her space. She used the towel carefully, almost respectfully, squeezing water from her hair, wiping her face, pressing the fabric against her shivering arms. Each small action seemed to make her shoulders drop a little lower, like the weight she carried was shifting, even if only for a moment. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the counter. The smell filled the room, warm and rich. When he handed one to her, she held it with both hands, letting the heat seep through her fingers. Steam rose around her face, softening the hard lines left by exhaustion. She didn't drink right away. Instead, she stared into the mug as though unsure if she should take a sip. Maybe she was afraid the warmth wasn't real, or that it wouldn't last, or that once she accepted it, she wouldn't be able to go back to the cold she had grown used to. He sat down in the chair across from her, far enough not to crowd her but close enough that she could see he wasn't going to let her stand alone like a stranger. "What's your name?" he asked softly. She tensed, fingers tightening around the mug. It was a simple question, but simple questions often carried complicated answers for people like her. After a long pause, she said quietly, "Lena." He repeated it in his mind, "Lena." It suited her, soft but strong, weathered but graceful. I know," she cut in gently. "Everyone around here knows who owns this ranch." He blinked in surprise. Her tone wasn't rude, just matter of fact. She wasn't impressed by his reputation or intimidated by it. She simply stated it like someone who had learned to observe everything carefully. He took a sip of his coffee. "How long have you been out there?" She froze again. He regretted the question as soon as it left his mouth. Her shoulders stiffened and her gaze dropped to the floor. "I'm not trying to pry," he said quickly. "I just want to know if you're all right." That softened her posture, even if only slightly. She swallowed, hands still wrapped around the warm mug. "Long enough," she murmured. "Long enough to know that storms like this aren't the worst thing out there." His chest tightened at her words. They were small, but they carried the kind of weight that didn't come from weather. She shifted her backpack a little, resting it against her leg. The movement made the contents shift inside, soft sounds that suggested clothing, a water bottle, maybe a few other necessities. No rattle of keys, no jingle of anything that might belong to a permanent home. "You don't have anywhere to stay," he said quietly, not as a question this time. She didn't deny it. She didn't look at him either. Instead, she focused on the flicker of the fire. "It's just temporary," she said softly. "Everything is temporary if you keep moving." The sentence hit him harder than he expected. She said it like a rule she lived by, like something she repeated to herself whenever she felt the world closing in. He wondered how many nights she had spent alone on empty roads or abandoned fields, convincing herself that she didn't need anything more. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. He didn't want to push her, but he also didn't want to let her drift back into the cold world she'd been surviving in. "You don't have to keep moving tonight," he said. "You can stay here. There's a spare room, a warm bed, no one's using it." Her breath caught. She blinked fast as if trying to hide the emotion rising behind her eyes. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered. "You're not," he said firmly. "You fixed my fence, that's more than most would do." A quiet laugh slipped out of her, small, tired, but real. "You don't have to repay me for that." "I'm not repaying you," he said. "I'm offering you a place to rest." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, fragile, like the room itself was waiting for her answer. She looked around again, the fire, the walls, the warm light settling gently over everything. Then she looked at him, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with a kind of cautious hope. "Just for one night," she whispered. "For as long as you need," he replied. Her fingers loosened on the mug. Her shoulders softened. Her eyes glowed faintly with something she had tried to bury, something like safety, something like belonging, something like a beginning she didn't know she was allowed to have. She didn't say yes out loud. She didn't have to. The moment she exhaled, slow, deep, relieved, he knew she wasn't planning to leave. Not tonight. Not while she was finally warm. Not while something inside both of them had begun to shift, quietly and without warning. And the ranch, which had felt empty for so long, suddenly felt less hollow. One life stepping into another. One quiet moment reshaping everything.